I've hiked since I was a teenager. Not competitively, not with any particular ambition. Just the kind of regular, meditative hiking that becomes part of how you manage a week. The trail system near the town where I settled in my late 20s was well mapped and well maintained, a network of marked paths through mixed forest that covered roughly 12 miles of connected loops. I knew it the way you know a place you've returned to hundreds of times, not perfectly, but with the comfortable confidence of familiarity. The loop I preferred took about 2 hours at a moderate pace. Orange trail markers on the trees, a creek crossing at the midpoint, a ridge section near the end that gave a clean view westward before the path descended back to the trailhead. I'd done it so many times that I'd stopped consulting the map. In late September, I took that loop on a quiet weekday morning and found a marker that shouldn't have been there. It was at a fork I knew well, the place where the Orange Trail continued straight and a social trail, an unofficial path worn by deer and the occasional off-route hiker, veered left toward the creek bank. I'd always gone straight, but this time the orange marker was on the left-hand tree. The marker was on the left-hand tree. I decided my memory was the problem and took the left fork. The path dissolved into undergrowth within a quarter mile, and I backtracked, found the main trail, and finished my loop without incident. I told myself the Parks Department had rerouted the trail. It seemed plausible. 2 weeks later, I found a second marker. Same situation, a fork, a fresh marker, pointing off route in a direction that felt deliberate. I didn't follow it this time. I stood there, looking at the paint, and thought about what it meant for someone to have put it there. Not signage that fell, not a faded marker misread. Fresh paint on a tree at a fork, directing a hiker off the maintained path. I reported it to the parks office. The man I spoke with listened carefully and said they hadn't installed any new markers recently. He said they'd look into it. He wrote down the location I described with a thoroughness that felt more than routine. Over the following month, I found 3 more, each at a fork or junction, each fresh, each pointing away from the maintained trail and toward terrain that was difficult to navigate, or far from the parking areas and road access. I stopped hiking alone. The detail I couldn't settle was that the markers were consistent. Same orange, same brush width, same installation height. Someone had the paint, had the knowledge of where the official marker sat, and was systematically placing alternatives, not randomly, specifically at decision points where a hiker would choose a direction. I went back to the parks office with photographs. This time the conversation was longer, and the ranger who joined it asked whether I'd seen anyone else on the trail in my recent visits. I said rarely. It was a weekday trail in the off-season. He nodded in the way people do when an answer confirms something. He told me they'd found evidence of a camp in a remote section of the forest, off-trail, perhaps a mile from one of the false markers. He was careful about specifics. He said they were looking into it. I asked what he thought the markers were for. He looked at me for a moment and said hikers who followed them would end up far from the trailhead in sections of forest without cell coverage, with limited ability to self-navigate back. He said it quietly, the way you say something that doesn't need emphasis. I haven't returned to that trail system. I've found other routes in other areas, and I go with company now, and I carry a physical map that I've read in full before I start. I don't trust painted marks on trees the way I used to. What made those markers frightening wasn't their presence, it was the patience they represented. Someone had walked that trail enough times to identify every decision point, had matched the official paint precisely, and had built a system of redirection designed to be indistinguishable from the real thing. They had learned the trail better than most people who loved it. They'd been waiting, quietly, for someone who trusted it enough to follow a mark without questioning it. The forest behind the property I rented was accessible through a gap in the back fence. A deliberate gap, the landlord had explained, because the previous tenants had used the trails back there for walking. It wasn't parkland exactly, a private timber holding that had been left largely unmanaged for years, dense second-growth forest cross-cut by old logging roads that made decent walking paths. I asked the landlord if people went back there regularly. He said not really, not anymore. I started walking it in my first week. The main logging road ran roughly north for about a mile before forking, and I had established an out-and-back routine that took 40 minutes and gave me exactly the reset I needed at the end of a workday. The forest was unremarkable in the best sense. Birch and beech and the occasional older oak, a soft floor of last year's leaves, the kind of quiet that isn't silence, but is the absence of human sound. About a third of a mile in, the road passed a natural clearing on the left, not large, perhaps the size of a living room, where the canopy broke and the undergrowth had stayed low. I passed it every day. After 2 weeks, I stopped noticing it. What I noticed in the 4th week was that someone had been in it. Not dramatically, the clearing looked the same, but in the center, the leaf litter was disturbed in a rough circle, compressed and flattened in a way that suggested someone had sat or stood there for some time. No fire ring, no equipment, no litter, just the pressed leaves and the circle they made. I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it. A deer bed, possibly. Deer compress leaf litter in exactly this way. I moved on. I moved on the same way I'd been moving on for weeks from small things that didn't quite fit. The circle was there the next day, still compressed, slightly larger, or perhaps just more noticeable now that I was looking for it. A few of the low branches at the clearing's edge had been bent back, I thought, though I wasn't certain I had examined them closely enough to be sure to be certain. I began arriving at the clearing with more attention than I'd been giving it. The compression was consistent across my next 6 visits, suggesting regular use. On the 7th visit, I found something I couldn't rationalize. A small stone had been placed at the clearing's center, flat and deliberate, the way a person places an object they intend to return to. I left it where it was. I turned around and went back. That evening, I thought about the geometry of it. The clearing was set back from the logging road. Someone using it would be invisible from the road. Someone in the clearing, however, had a clear sight line to the road through the thin edge of the undergrowth. A person sitting in that clearing could watch the road without being visible to anyone walking it. I'd been walking that road every day for a month, at approximately the same time each day. I took a different route the following week. On the 3rd day of the new route, walking a logging spur I hadn't used before, I came over a low rise and stopped. There was a man in the tree line at the base of the rise, standing still, partially screened by birch trunks, watching the road ahead. He was perhaps 60 feet away. He wasn't doing anything, no equipment, no task, just standing and watching. He registered me at the same moment I registered him. We were both still for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. I turned and walked back at a pace I maintained as steady as I could manage, and I didn't look back until I was through the gap in the fence, with it closed behind me. I called the property management company and told them I saw someone in the timber holding who appeared to be watching the trails. They said they'd contact the landlord. I don't go back there. The gap in the fence is boarded over now, by my own doing and with the landlord's agreement. The logging road is still back there, I assume. The clearing is still back there. And possibly the stone still placed exactly where someone left it. I want to be careful about how I tell this one, because the part that matters most is easy to describe and hard to convey. It's a timing problem. Not the events themselves, but the intervals between them, the way each piece was separated from the next, just by enough time and normalcy that I kept almost talking myself out of what I was seeing. I ran a trail near my home 3 mornings a week. The trail was about 4 miles, a loop through mixed woodland that connected back to the road near my neighborhood. The section nearest my house ran along a ridgeline with good visibility on both sides. The far section, away from the neighborhood, dropped into a hollow, and the tree coverage was dense enough that visibility dropped to 20 or 30 feet. I'd been running this trail for 2 years. I knew its sounds, the way crows moved through the hollow in the morning, the particular creak of a large beech on the ridge that moved in any wind. I knew which sections were muddy after rain and which were dry even in wet weather. The first morning, something felt different. I couldn't identify why. Just a sense of the trail being less empty than it was, a quality to the silence in the hollow that had a different texture than usual. I finished the loop, showered, went to work, and dismissed it before I articulated it clearly. 3 days later, the feeling returned, stronger, specific to the hollow. The crows weren't there that morning, which was unusual. The hollow was very quiet, and my footsteps sounded different in that quiet, pronounced, isolated, the sound of something singular moving through a space where sound carries. I slowed without deciding, and in that slowing, I heard it. Footsteps behind me, not running, keeping a pace consistent with mine. At a distance, I put it 40 or 50 feet. When I slowed, they slowed. When I paused, a pause of 3 or 4 seconds, then they stopped. I turned around. The trail behind me was empty as far as I could see. 20 feet of visibility, tree cover on both sides, the morning light falling in the specific angled way it did in that hollow at that hour. I ran the remaining mile at a pace I didn't examine analytically and didn't stop until I was on the road with houses visible. I went back to the trail once more 2 days later with a friend. In the hollow, I pointed out the section where I'd heard the sound. My friend walked behind me at the relevant distance. Their footsteps matched exactly what I'd heard. I've run with someone since then, or I've taken the road route. The trail is still there, the hollow is still there. What I haven't been able to determine, and this is the part that stays with me, is whether whoever was in the hollow that morning had been following me, or whether they'd been ahead of me and I'd caught up to where they'd already stopped and were waiting. The footsteps had been behind me, but if someone knew the trail well and knew my pace, they could have been positioned in the hollow before I arrived and let me pass and then followed. The difference matters. One is someone who found me on the trail. The other is someone who knew I was coming.